All right, so welcome to the Black Archive Safer Home Virtual Series. My name is Louis Berthan. I am the Assistant Archivist, and today we're going to do my segment, which is called Legacies, Profiles in Greatness. And, so it's been a couple months since this has started. Hi, I'm Juice. Thank you for joining. And, I don't quite remember if I had done this when I started this segment or at any point afterwards. But, so the point of me doing the Legacies, Profiles in Greatness segment is because it is not only a way to highlight what the archives has in its collection on different figures in our community's history, but it's also a way for me to tell these micro-histories as a repudiation of kind of what is the larger narrative in the United States. And hi, Miami Gardens Now. Thank you for joining. Not Too Cute Kitty. So the reason I tell these stories is because these micro-histories are really important. Not only do they highlight these great figures in our own community's history, I think it also does the other job of showing how deeply tied to our own history we are, whether we know these names or not. And I know that my wonderful viewers, I know that most of you guys know these people, and I'm more than happy to educate and bring more fame to their names because they deserve it. And I think it also does the job of showing that civil rights movement and these different movements didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't that Martin Luther King came along and everything got better. Everything has many moving pieces that happen at the same time. And I think the point of going into these stories really highlights that and shows us how our community played a part in that story. So now I'm going to get started. We're going to talk about Dewey Knight Jr. So here's a photo of him for everyone. And all right, so for those of you, unfortunately, the archives are not open to visitors now, but when it is, and you want to come visit and view a collection on Dewey Knight, we have MS-136, a Dewey Knight collection with a date range from 1983 to 2004. And so Dewey Knight III, his son, said this of his father: "A common man who stayed in touch with the common people, compassionate towards the downtrodden and concerned that he prospered while others were left behind. Never was his desire to leave anyone behind. A friend of his said that he was competent, ethical, and humane public servant who made time for small kindnesses and paid attention to details while always remaining on top of the larger agenda." So, Dewey Knight was born in Daytona Beach, Florida, May 12, 1930. And before I get into what he did in his life, I want to talk a little bit about his family. I found a newspaper article that kind of detailed his family's legacy. So it's titled Heritage of Service. It was a part of Knight's heritage to serve. Knight's grandfather in Daytona Beach was Florida's first black police officer. An uncle, a lawyer from New York, served in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s. Another uncle managed the nation's first black radio station in Atlanta. An aunt was New York's first black woman judge. But such breakthroughs were lost in Daytona Beach, where Knight grew up next door to an elderly man who had been born a slave. "We drank at segregated water fountains. We had segregated public toilets, segregated restaurants," Knight once said. "We lived at the world's most famous beach, but weren't allowed to use it." His mother had a college education, but worked as a maid. His college-educated father could only progress to become Daytona Beach's first black postal worker. "He was a brilliant man who was constrained by the limits of segregation," Knight said. So let's continue. So, Dewey Knight earned his bachelor's degree in business administration from Bethune-Cookman College in 1951. That is the same college that his mother attended. After this, he decided to serve our country, and he did a 4-year tour of duty with the U.S. Air Force. After this, Knight returned and completed his master's degree in social work from Atlanta University in 1957. And the last bit of schooling he completed in 1970. It was an urban executive program for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So, after completing his tour of duty and earning his master's degree, he came back to Florida and moved to Miami in 1959. This was the birthplace of his wife, Clara Louise Brown. His first job was at a place called the Kendall Children's Home. He started as a caseworker and rose to become the first black social worker for the agency. So, I actually have a newspaper article that I'm going to read afterwards and just give you a little more details about this. So, it's really interesting. Just keep listening. So, at this time, he advocated for the integration of juvenile youth homes. And he did this despite being threatened with jail time from the local courts. So, also just an aside, when we think of segregation, we think of the public toilets and public facilities, but even things like juvenile youth homes were segregated. And I think it's worth repeating that, because, you know, even someone like myself who knows the history I'm still surprised at this sometimes. So he continues on, and in 1967, he becomes the first black director of the welfare department in Dade County history. When he was in this position, he instituted intensive counseling for individuals and families on welfare, and he also opened the first neighborhood youth cooperation program for out-of-school youths and helped establish a residence home and halfway house for troubled youngsters. In 1969, he accepted an interim assignment as the head of the Division of Youth Services. There, Knight played a pivotal role in the War on Poverty and the Neighborhood Development Program. There was a state contract. There was the U.S. Title XX funds. These funds were used for the start of the start of addiction treatment clinic, and the construction of the Caleb Community Center, along with several other facilities and programs. All took form as a result of his work. In the 1970s, he continued his work and took on additional responsibilities. He stepped up as the acting director of the Metro Dade Housing and Urban Development, which is Little HUD. And at the same year, he was appointed to be the assistant county manager, becoming the first black man to hold this post. And while he was in this position, Knight created and organized the Department of Human Resources and helped lay the foundation for the Elderly Services Program. Knight was not done, however, and he continued his rise through government service. In 1985, Knight became the first person to serve as the deputy county manager. In this position, he provided direct assistance to the county manager and the 1.8 million citizens of Dade County. This position was only ever held by Knight. Over various years, he also stepped up to become the acting county manager, specifically in 1976, 1987, and 1988. Though he was offered this position multiple times, he always denied it, citing his family as his first priority. He retired in 1988 and became a partner in a management consulting group. So Knight's community service went far beyond his professional duties. He found the time to be a clinical professor at Barry University's Graduate School of Social Work. It is also believed that he served on almost every major social service committee in the county at one time or another. He worked with the trustee boards of Greater Bethel AME, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity, and more. And let me read you a couple more organizations that he was affiliated with. So he was also affiliated with he was at one point in 1970 the treasurer of the United Way, board member of the James E. Scott Community Association. He was with Chase Federal and Savings and Loan Association, the Urban League Director Emeritus, Director of the American Red Cross, Trustee of Stillman College, Tuscaloosa, and also a member of the Sigma Pi Phi fraternities, and the Miami Varsity Club and American Society for Public Administration. So he had a hand in a lot of different organizations here in South Florida. And so, unfortunately, he met his untimely death on June 21st of 1995. He was still a very young man at this point. He was only 65. And the year after he had passed away, a family medical center was dedicated in his honor. It became the Dewey W. Knight Jr. Family Medical Center on February 23rd, 1996. Also, State Road 112 became the Dewey Knight Jr. Memorial Highway in honor of him. So I did a little biography, and now I'm going to read to you from a newspaper that was an interview with him. And I think this will give you a lot of insight into who he was as a person, his philosophy on his work, and what he did, right? So this is a Miami Herald article from 1983. Why at this time, in this country, in this county, why would anyone want to be in public administration during this trying period of credibility, this trying period of sensitivity, this trying period for our community? Dewey Knight Jr., the assistant county manager, the $72,000 a year number 2 executive in that great stew of metropolitan government known as Dade County, asks the rhetorical question of 5 young government interns. Then he offers his very personal answer, evolved over years of the cutting edge of local leadership. He tells them about a county that, I'm sorry about that. So a county that thrives in crisis, of people with strong fiber of the push and pull of values and politics. Dade, he says, is characterized not by the overused hack phrase, ethnic polarization, but rather by a much more telling term, indifference. Each man says, I've got to get over with my thing. The advantage to this is that you aren't dealing with a rigid system or attitudes of ingrained hatred. There is room to negotiate, says Knight, negotiator par excellence. You have made a wise choice coming to date at this time, he tells his interns. He didn't want to do it. No, not one bit. A child of the segregated South, Dewey Knight Jr., son of a domestic and the only black mailman in Daytona Beach, graduate of Bethune-Cookman College, like his mother, went north just as soon as he could when he finished his Air Force service and his master's in social work from Atlanta University. I wanted no part of the South and its limited opportunities. I found a job in Bridgeport, Connecticut, close to the theater, music, family, and friends in New York. The job, working with children and families just like I wanted, paid $5,200 a year. And the young professional had everything the way he liked, with one glaring exception: his bride. Clara Brown Knight was still wedded to living in Miami, still teaching in Miami, still close to her family in Miami, and despising the Bridgeport cold whenever she came. He returned to the South, grudgingly. It was 1959 in the segregated city of Miami. His new counseling job at the Kendall Children's Home paid 20% less than the Connecticut job. Yet Dewey Knight was a man who makes himself happy, so he did. Those children were the saving grace. When I began moving up the ladder of administration, I had to be ordered to give up my caseload. They still remember me. They stopped me in the courthouse to say hello. I wrote about some of them in the newspapers. Sometimes it's a success story. Sometimes it's a trip to Rayford. My greatest ambition was, and still is, to operate and own a house for delinquent boys. My ambition is to go up the ladder of children's care and say to the state, give me 75 of the kids you've given up on and let me see what I can do. Someone someday will take him up on that. People have always handed Knight the tough job, saying, see what you can do, saying, try it, and if you don't like it, you can go back. Knight, who carried the taglines, highest ranking black, or first black, for so long they seemed like a part of his name in print, never went back. So this is telling the story of how he got into government service. So it starts off, who's that fat fellow who talks so much? He makes some sense. County Manager Porter Homer asked after meeting Knight, then the Director of Professional Services at Kendall Children's Home. Homer appointed him as County Welfare Director in August 1967. It was a time when the welfare rights movement was at its peak, when there was a chance to make change, when the funding for new programs, and there were disgruntled clients marching on some offices every week, it seemed, Knight recalls with his rich laugh. Homer and Knight formed a working relationship that would lead downtown in fairly short order. In 1969, Knight was asked to step in as acting head of the chronically troubled Division of Youth Services. In May 1970, when the director of Metro Department of Housing and Urban Development, Little HUD, was incapacitated in an accident, Knight was asked to handle the Little HUD post, too. It was all supposed to be very hush-hush until I was taken to meet the supervisors. But the custodian of the building overheard a rumor, and when I arrived, I had to go down a long corridor to get to the meeting. There was a black secretary in every doorway, grinning from ear to ear, Knight recalls. In the conference room, he was the only black. By August 1970, he had been named the Assistant County Manager, charged with coordinating the county's social action and human services departments. The post paid a range from $22,000 to $27,000 a year, and he worked first for Homer and then for Ray Good until June 1976, when Good left to be the president of the Babcock Company. Knight filled the gap for 6 months until the new man, Merritt Sturheim, arrived from Pinellas County. Today, Sturheim introduces Knight as the man who everyone knows could have had my job. So why didn't Knight take it? Knight was 46 years old then. There was rumors about his health. The commissioner said Knight put out the word he didn't want the job. I wanted him to take it, Clara Knight says. I did. Then he sat us down and talked to the family. He said that if he took that job, we might be happy and be glorious in his success. But when you go to the top and you don't have any place else to go but down when they shoot you down. She remembers. He knows what he wants, and that is what he's going to be. Knight remembers the period of intensity by its exhaustion, by the lack of time for his sons, Dewey III and Patrick, virtually no golf or fishing, and just 3 days of vacation. He remembers the guidelines of his mentors, Homer and Good, to have thick skin and a sense of humor. I've got a sense of humor, all right, but I still haven't developed a thick skin. I've never been able to lose one and move on to the next battle the way they could. I'm not a born manager, like Howard Gary, the unique type that thrives on being in the center. And just a quick aside, you can really see how humble Dewey Knight Jr. is. I'm listing off all of his achievements and all the things he did while he was in government service and how he pushed and how he was the first black in many of these posts. And yet, at the same time, and this is a way later point in his career, he's saying, I'm not really the manager type. He's very humble, and he discounts himself a little too much, I think. So he continues, I have moments of great trauma when I have to be part of a decision to reduce greatly needed services, seeing the negatives and not seeing them corrected. I've had times when I had to leave the commission meetings. A trusted associate who could read those terrible moments in his eyes or his posture, someone like Connie Borgschult-Jones, administrative assistant to the county manager, will just sit with me quietly in my office while I stare out the window thinking things through. And I have not had a manager who didn't care. So that's kind of it for this article. I'm going to read you one more portion of it, though, because it kind of shows you what he had to deal with while he's in these government positions. So when Burdine's chairman, Dick McEwen, a well-intentioned but abrupt fellow, offered with a big Al Jolson Mammy-style grin to do the introduction to the Metro Miami Action Plan for the Black community in blackface, Knight was silent for 10 seconds. Knight's face showed no emotion. His voice was only slightly lower and slightly slower when he finally spoke, and he said, "We aren't doing a carnival, Mr. McEwen." Although longtime observers of the county government say he must have had a deep streak of anger in him, Knight does not mention the times he had been called a token, the times he had been insulted by deliberation and by ignorance. So just think about the poise that you would have needed to not go off on someone who offers to do blackface. I mean, this was in 83, so it wasn't even, I mean, it's 40 years ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. Not long enough ago to think that was acceptable, because it was not. Another article, and this is from the same article in 1983. So Dewey Knight actually offered to do a roast. So this was an advertisement for a roast of Dewey Knight, and I'm going to read to you from that. So tonight's the night. A dozen friends and colleagues will roast Dewey Knight tonight before an expected audience of 400 in the grand ballroom of the Pavilion Hotel. I'll roast them right back, so watch out, Knight says. I only went along with this because it is a benefit for Al Lofton, a fine young man with a young family to support. He was the first black highway patrol trooper, and now he has multiple sclerosis, and they have massive medical bills. Organized by Jim Barker, governmental affairs manager for Southern Bell, the roasters represent virtually every civic group and government body Knight has dealt with in his 24 years. Here is a Dewey Knight story told by Mel Adams, director of the Dade County Housing and Urban Development Authority. One year, there was a crime wave in Kendall. There was machine gun shootings in Dadeland. People were gunned down on South Dixie Highway. There was an execution in a townhouse neighborhood. At just about the time, the county commission refused to allow low-income housing in the Hammocks, a middle-class Kendall development. Knight turned to me and said, "That neighborhood's not safe for our people anyway." So I guess that's a little bit of his trademark sense of humor. And if you didn't know that all of that happened in Miami, yes, Miami was a very dangerous place in the 80s. So this is from another article. This is from the Miami News. Starts off, Dewey Knight, Dade's low-key but effective black administrator. Dewey Knight Jr., the name rings a bell, but hardly anybody knows exactly what Dade's top black administrator has done in county government. Knight says he likes it that way. "I'm no leader, I'm a follower," the assistant county manager said sheepishly during an interview. "I only lead my children." You see how he discounts himself. This is not the only time he's done this. Knight, however, is credited with helping get hundreds of county government jobs open to minorities. His admirers say he was qualified to be county manager when the job opened up several years ago. Knight said he wasn't interested. He said his family, his wife, Clara, and their children, Patrick and Dewey III, is the reason that he hasn't sought the county manager job. Knight served 6 months as the interim county manager when Ray Good stepped down in 1976. "To do that job, I found I had to put in 7 days a week, 24 hours a day." Knight said, "That's too much of a sacrifice for family and myself." Good believes Knight could have handled the manager's job on a permanent basis if he had wanted it. "He has the experience and the temperament to do the job," says Good. "After almost a decade of working with the county, he's already demonstrated that he could do it." And so they don't mind firing a county manager because they know they have Dewey to hold things together, added Garth Reeves, publisher of the Miami Times, Dade's leading black weekly newspaper. Knight, 50, was hired by the county in 1959 as a social worker at the Kendall Home for Children. His salary was $328 a month. 2 or 3 years later, the facility was integrated without a great deal of fanfare, thanks to him and Ike Witherspoon, who was the county director of professional services. We developed a plan to start with younger children and work up to the older children, Knight recalled. Knight said Good, who was then the county's welfare director, reviewed their plan and said, this Monday, a week from now, we will take half the black kids and put them in the white cottages and half the white kids and put them in the black cottages. Surprisingly, there was less of a reaction by the parents of the children than by professionals who worked with them. Interesting. So, I'm going to continue, and this is the last article I'm going to read to you guys of. This is Dewey Knight was talking about his experience while he was in Atlanta University and the influence that Rosa Parks had on him. So, Dewey Knight is a low-key black leader, perhaps because he is a product of not a product of the raging 1960s, but a child of the 1950s, when the modern civil rights movement was taking its first faltering steps. It's interesting, we're talking on the 25th anniversary of Rosa Parks saying no to giving up her seat on a bus to a white man, Knight noted recently. Parks' refusal to give up her seat led to a 300-day boycott of Montgomery, Alabama buses and their desegregation. The action also led to the birth of the modern civil rights movement. Rosa Parks didn't have any intention of starting something like that, Knight said, but she was tired and her feet hurt and her dignity was being stepped on. She wasn't about to take it. Other people have to pick up on that. If the problem of racism is going to be licked, it has to be licked on a much broader perspective, and that's something that still applies today. Knight remembers those days well. When Parks refused to get to the back of the bus in 1955, he was a graduate student at Atlanta University studying social work. Parks had a personal influence on young Knight. I began reassessing my focus on individual achievement and movement. When most of us got to graduate school, we said, we've got it made now. But when we started looking at what we were doing, we realized we had a responsibility to help. And so this is the last portion of what I'm going to read to you today. And so it was so again, this article is in 1983. This is about 3 years removed from the Miami uprising, the McDuffie uprising here in Miami. So it was the kind of reasoning that dictated what Knight did during Dade County's riots last May. While some blacks raged in the streets, Knight quietly worked at the Central Police Command Post, trying to find ways to work on the problems and minimize those problems. My role was more one of pulling together for county government. Number one, something had to be done in terms of handling the emergency that existed, not just the police problem, but people who had their own problems. Women were having babies, they needed milk and diapers. People needed medicine but couldn't get out. Those needs had to be met. Number two, I had to determine how to move as rapidly as possible to remove the hazardous conditions, the burned out buildings, and the rubble in the streets. And third, I had to plan how we could move in an affirmative way to remove the overriding positions that had created the kind of climate that created a riot, and pull together the appropriate people on our staff and others in the community. My focus is what we can do to work and prevent and resolve, Knight said. Sure, it can happen again. It can happen again anywhere. Recognizing the fact that it can, seems to me, raises a challenge to be creative and moving to resolve. So, thank you guys so much for joining me today. Thank you to everyone who joined, T. Barbara, Andres, Lou, I saw Gio, and Bianca. Thank you. And so this is a photo of Dewey Knight one more time. And I'm going to show you a couple more photos before we log off for today. So here we go. There we go. So you have these photos right here. Here we go. So you have a photo of him with his wife Clara. You have this is a photo of his very famous sideburns. So this is Dewey Knight Jr. Another photo of him. This is photos of him with some friends at his table. Another photo of him cooking. And this is the advert for the roast that I was telling you guys about. This is a comic that was drawn of Dewey Knight. And this is the last photo of the Miami News. So, thank you guys for joining me today. If you guys have any questions on Dewey Knight, I'd be more than happy to take them. Unfortunately, tomorrow we're not going to have a virtual field trip because AAAM is happening, which is exciting. If you are starved for content and you missed the Is It True Tales from the Magic City on Monday, it's because it wasn't on Instagram, it was on Facebook. We did a Zoom panel with our excellent archivist, Jocelyn Hurtado, and we had a wonderful guest, the National Park Service Ranger, Gary Bremen, It was an amazing talk. It was about an hour. So if you are looking for content, if you're looking for something to do, you can always go to our Facebook page and watch that. I was a part of it as well. It was a lot of fun talking about Lancelot Jones and his legacy. So I'm not seeing any questions. So I think I'm going to take that to log off. But I appreciate you guys. Thank you for joining me again this week. Please stay safe. And I will join you next week with another Legacies, Profiles, and Greatness. Thank you, and have a good one.